All right, guys, let's get into it. Going to just start off by reading our verses today, and then we are going to break it all down. So if you're new here, we are in the Gospel of Mark. We're in chapter 1, and we are at verse 29. If you have the Bible that I suggested everyone get, it is on page 1223. All right, guys. The word of God says, as soon as they left the synagogue, they went into Simon and Andrew's house with James and John. Simon's mother-in-law was lying in bed with a fever, and they told him about her at once. So he went to her and took her by the hand and raised her up. The fever left her, and she began to serve them. When evening came, after the sun had set, they brought him all those who were sick and demon-possessed. The whole town was assembled at the door, and he healed many who were sick with various diseases and drove out many demons. And he would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him. All right. So it seems like just a story about what's going on. But as you guys know, if you've been here long enough, you know that in a little bit of verses, there can be so much depth and so much we can learn from it. And what's interesting is these are more verses than we usually read. Sometimes we'll only read like 2 or 3. So there's a lot in this little bit, but there's also some things that are going on here that you might not catch off the first few times reading it. And I'm hoping to do a good job at explaining that here. Now, if you've been with us the last few weeks, we've went through Jesus calling his first disciples, Andrew, Simon, who is Peter, James, and John. Then we went from him calling his disciples to them watching him teach in the synagogue on Sabbath. And then after he taught at the synagogue, they witnessed Jesus cast a demon out of someone. They witnessed him silence the demon from speaking, and this demonstrated Jesus's authority over the supernatural. And today, we're going to watch how their ministry how Jesus's ministry follows them home, specifically Andrew and Peter, and how Jesus essentially following Jesus to their home, because they're following Jesus, but they're following him back to their home. Very interesting here. And how Peter's home turns into a hub for the ministry. So let's just start off with verse 29. It says, as soon as they left the synagogue, they went into Simon and Andrew's house with James and John. So Peter, who is Simon, his house became a hub for Jesus and the disciples, right? And we see this throughout the Gospel of Mark. You'll see in the house, right? So Jesus was in the house. And this house many times refers to Andrew and Peter's house. And we'll see in a bit that this happens almost immediately, that this becomes a hub. And you see that in verse 30, right? So here we have Simon's mother-in-law. Well, I mean, here we are in verse 30, and then after this, you'll see that. So Simon's mother-in-law was lying in bed with a fever, and they told him about her at once. So he went to her, took her by the hand, and raised her up. The fever left her, and she began to serve them. So notice her response, right? Here we see a woman that is incapacitated by illness, unable to participate in life around her. Peter and we can assume Andrew was taking care of her as well. Her family is concerned for her well-being, as we all are when one of our family members is sick. So they tell Jesus about her condition. And in response, Jesus just approaches her with no hesitation, extends his hand, raises her up, and she is healed. She's healed. There's no grand gesture. There's no elaborate words. As we saw last week, Jesus, when he silenced the demon, it was just, in New York terms, shut up, and get out, right? So just a simple touch from Jesus to Peter's mother-in-law, and immediately the fever left her. There was nothing elaborate about it. Now, what happens next is, I think, super significant, right? The moment she's healed, what does she do? She goes right into, oh, did I lose my camera? Yep, I froze. Hold up. This thing be tweaking sometimes. At least it froze on a good frame. All right, we're back in action, right? All right. So the moment that she was healed, what does she do? She begins to serve. She begins to serve Jesus and the people who were with him, right? So there's no like pause. There's no, wow, I was sick for so long and now I'm healed. Let me rejoice in this healing. She rejoiced by serving. So there was no consideration of her previous sickness. She wasn't sitting there contemplating anything of like, oh, wow, how did this happen? Or man, I was sick for so long. Now I'm feeling better. Let me just chill. No, her immediate response was action. She's touched by Jesus, and that her immediate response to that touch is boom, right into action. And that action being service. And this reaction shows us a fundamental truth of being touched by Jesus, whether that's spiritually, physically healed, or a miracle that happens in your life, or just salvation. And I don't even like to use the word just, because salvation is the greatest miracle of them all. It's when we experience Jesus touching our lives, our natural response should be to serve others. That's one of the things that Christians are known for the most, is their servanthood to others. The world can hate us all they want, but our track record speaks for itself when it comes to serving those who are in need. Christianity is not a selfish faith. I did a video response the other day to a mystic Christian, which, there is no such thing as a mystic Christian. But he was saying that he looked at Christianity as, it's all about you and you getting saved. It's so selfish. It's so ego. It's all about the ego. It's only about you and you getting saved. And when I heard him talking about that, I'm like, what Christianity have you experienced? It's not, we don't just get saved so that we are saved. Yeah, well, now I'm saved. Let me just go about my life. No, we are to share that salvation with others. We are to go and serve others. We are called to be servants of the poor, the widow, the orphans. We're called to do this. So Christianity is not a selfish faith. And so the healing of Peter's mother-in-law just illustrates this point perfectly. Once she's restored, she doesn't retreat into comfort or, focus on what she can now do for herself. Instead, she goes right into engaging in serving the people who are present. Her service is a testament to the gratitude and new life that she received through Jesus. And we should do the same. We receive new life in Jesus. We should serve others in response. So when Jesus touches our lives, it's not just for our benefit. As I said before, Christianity is not a selfish, it's not a selfish religion. When we're touched by God, when we're touched by Jesus, we should be moved to serve. And I would implore you guys, if you are attending a local church, which I hope that you are, look for a way you can serve it. My wife and I, when we were in Puerto Rico, we worked with the youth out there every single Friday. We were working, not every single one, but most Fridays we would work with the youth, and it turned into one of the most rewarding things imaginable. We just plugged into a local church out here, and I cannot wait until Ronan is a little bit less, what could I call it? Ronan is my son, for those of you who don't know. He just requires a lot of attention right now, but we're looking forward to when we can bring him to church more. We brought him once, he made it halfway through, started crying, but we're looking forward to serving at church, because it's just, that's what we should be doing. And when you do it, it's so fulfilling. You think of it, in our selfish society, we think of it as like, man, I just, I don't have the resources to help this person. Oh, I'm going to be so tired. But once you do it, you feel so filled. I can't explain it. That's why every year we go to Guatemala to build a school. You can't explain what happens. By the way, we're looking for 2 more people to come with us. So if you want to come, let me know. Right. So anyway, I'm getting off on a little tangent. So the theme of that is when we're touched by Jesus, serve. That should be the action that we're called to do, is to serve. Now, before we move on to the rest of the passage, there's something important to notice. But before I move on, is there any questions about what I just said? Or do I got a thumbs up to keep going? All right, sounds good. All right. So when Jesus healed Peter's mother-in-law, it wasn't just an act of kindness, right? It was also a way to help Peter focus on his ministry, focus on following Jesus. Now, we don't hear about Peter's father-in-law in the Bible. There's no mention of him. So it's likely he'd passed away, and the mother-in-law is living at Peter and Andrew's house, right? So in those times, Peter would be responsible for taking care of his mother-in-law, as it's commanded to do right by widows and to honor your father and mother. We find this in Deuteronomy and Exodus. So by healing Peter's mother-in-law, Jesus made sure not only that she was healthy again, and now she's available to serve and she's serving, but this took a huge load off of Peter's shoulders so he could be more of a servant, and so he could have more time and more energy to serve, because Peter would not, Peter, who's that guy? Peter wouldn't be able to focus on his ministry if in the back of his mind he's worried about his sick mother-in-law. So Jesus understood that for Peter to be free to serve and spread the gospel, he needed his family to be taken care of. So by healing Jesus's mother-in-law, Jesus showed how much he cared for Peter and Peter's family, and shows that he had a plan for Peter. And if you guys know who Peter is, he is one of the leaders of the early church. And he was so important to the early ministry and to the rest of the apostles and the people who started to follow Jesus. He was one of the key figures in the early Christian movement. So this little gesture that goes unnoticed, I think, has so much depth to it, because we just see Jesus healing Peter's mother-in-law, and we're like, yeah, that's Jesus. That's what he does. He heals people. But we sometimes miss the point that this frees Peter up to be as all in on the ministry as Jesus was calling him to be. Now, we can take note of this in our own lives, right? If we look at 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 8, you don't have to flip there. I have it right here, so I'll read it for you. This is Paul speaking. So he says, anyone who does not provide for their relatives, and especially for their own household, has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. There's some harsh words, right? So this verse shows us that taking care of our family is an extremely important part of being a Christian, right? I think sometimes we get this idea, and I'll touch on this in a bit, but we get this idea that we can kind of neglect our family if we're serving God, if we're serving Jesus, and that is just not true. We can trick ourselves into thinking that we're doing the right thing because, Jesus said, seek ye first the kingdom of heaven and all, the kingdom of God and all its righteousness. And we sometimes think that us putting God first means that we're neglectfully putting our family second. No. That's not how this works, guys. All right. So our ministry and how we serve God and others should not come at the cost of neglecting our family. The Bible makes it ridiculously clear that we have a responsibility to our family, even more so if our family are believers. How we treat and care for our family members shows our faith in action. And it's a big part of our testimony and how others see us as Christians. Think about pastors who, they may have big followings, they may have huge church attendance, they may have all of this, and on the outside it's like, wow, they're serving God so much, but then they fall because they cheated on their spouse, or they have family issues at home because they're working so much on the ministry that their family is falling apart, and there's anger in the house. And that is one of the biggest reasons why people will leave the church, is because the person who is leading that church, which should always be Jesus and not a pastor, but pastors as well as elders, they co-lead the congregation. But this is Jesus's church we're talking about here. But anyway, it's another side note. I do that a lot. Side note and side note and side note. But it's a big reason why people leave the church. So you, especially if you're all in on ministry and you're all in, let's say you're a pastor, you got to make sure that your family is good, because if your family, you are looked at as the example for your congregation. When you're doing ministry, people are looking at you as an example of what it means to walk with Christ. So if you're neglecting your family, people are going to see that, and they're going to say, oh yeah, he's in the wrong. And even unbelievers know that that's wrong, to neglect your family, right? So very important there. Now, taking care of our family is not separate from our ministry. It's a crucial part of it. When we love, support, and provide for our families, we are living out our faith in a way that everybody can see it. If we ignore our families while trying to do ministry, we're not showing the true love and care that Jesus teaches us. Now, this doesn't mean, listen here, this doesn't mean that you allow them to heap burdens deliberately on you to keep you from ministry. But just don't neglect your duty as a good son, a good daughter, a good sister, a good brother, a good father, a good mother. Just don't neglect your duty in that sense, right? I know it's difficult when your family's not believers. Most of my families are not believers. So sometimes when I'm like, no, I can't go to that event, or if they're doing something on Sunday and I'm like, no, I got to go to church. Or if I'm serving somewhere on a Friday night, they want to do something on a Friday night, I'm working with the youth. They get it now, but originally it was really difficult for them to understand, But what I did, and my wife is so good at this too, is we just made sure that we showed up when we were available, and made sure that they did not feel like they were like second to anything. We want to treat our family right. Now, some might ask, well, what about Luke 14:26, right? Because we're talking about not neglecting your family while you're doing ministry. And Luke 14:26 says, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. So some people read that and they're like, well, Jesus is telling me to like abandon my family. Yeah, he said hate them. And we're gonna dig into this because I think this is relevant to our topic in Mark, right? So just understand, that word hate right there, Jesus is using hyperbolic language. This is exaggerating, and this was hyperbolic language was used in ancient Jewish language like crazy. Like this is how we talk, us New Yorkers, especially Italians. Like we exaggerate everything, right? And it's not that it's not true what we're saying. It's just we exaggerate it for emphasis, right? So it's hyperbolic language. So Jesus is using hyperbolic language to emphasize the cost of discipleship. In the cultural context of Jesus's time, hyperbole was a common rhetorical device to make a strong point. The term hate here is not meant to be understood literally, but as a way to express priority and allegiance. Remember that, priority and allegiance. In the parallel passage to this, we find it in Matthew 10:37. So you guys know the Gospels, they're all telling the same story from different perspectives, right? So in Matthew 10:37, it helps to clarify this. It says, the one who loves a father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. The one who loves a son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. So it gives you a little bit more clarity on that. It's about your allegiance and your priority, right? So Jesus is calling for the highest loyalty and devotion to him. Discipleship demands that our commitment to Jesus takes precedence over all other relationships and priorities. But that does not mean that we should literally hate and neglect our family members, but that our love for Christ should be so great that all other loves are secondary in comparison. Jesus himself criticized the Pharisees for neglecting family obligations under the guise of quote unquote religious duty. We see this in Mark chapter 7, verses 9 through 13, which we will eventually get to. So he upheld the commandment to honor your father and mother. Even Jesus, when he was hanging on the cross, made sure that his mother would be taken care of. We see this in John chapter 19, verses 26 and 27. So Jesus hanging on the cross, this is how important it is to take care of your family. He's hanging on the cross, literally about to fulfill everything that was prophesied. He's about to give up his spirit and say to Telestai, it is finished. He's about to do all this, but first, making sure that his mother is good, right? So just the overall theme of this, I just want you to have a correct understanding of this. Your allegiance to Jesus is not to be confused with the ministry you feel that he's given you. Your ministry isn't, your ministry should never take precedent over priorities, right? Like you can't, I've harped on this too much. You guys get it. Just don't neglect your family. You guys get what I'm saying. All right. So we're about to move on. But before I do, are we good on that? Any questions about that? Because I know it's a convoluted and nuanced topic within this. And I just want to make sure that you guys, because I know that this is beginner Bible study and everything, but I know that there's some who are, being more vocal about their faith, like Angel, there's people being more vocal about their faith and putting it out there and everything. And I just want you guys to have a correct understanding. It's so good that if you want to be in ministry and you want to be leading people to Christ and you want to be doing all that stuff, it's so good to just have the perspective that God cares about you caring about your family. I've talked to pastor after pastor after pastor, and they're like, hey, your first role in ministry is to make sure your family is good. So just wanted to make that clear for you guys and anybody catching the replay. All right. So moving on, we're actually, we are coming to the second half of this, right? So now we get to see Jesus's authority on full display. We're in verse 32 now, guys, verse 32. When evening came, after the sun set, they brought to him all who were sick and demon-possessed. The whole town was assembled at the door, and he healed many who were sick with various diseases and drove out many demons. Now there's more that comes after that, but I'm saving that for after this, okay? So one thing we can see is that the people waited until Sabbath was over. So Sabbath goes from Friday when it gets dark all the way to Saturday when it gets dark. So it goes from Friday night all the way to Saturday night. So when Sabbath is over, it's after sunset, okay? So the people waited until after Sabbath was over to bring the sick to Jesus. So they followed the rules that we found in Exodus 20:10, that, against carrying burdens on the Sabbath. So it's important that, he did all of this stuff in the synagogue on the Sabbath, but the people who witnessed all of this, they still upheld the Sabbath. And just imagine how impatient you would be. Like, you got to wait until sundown. We can assume that it happened in the morning, that the teachings and the demon casting out that we spoke about last week happened in the morning. And now they got to wait all day. Like, think about this. They just witnessed this guy come out of nowhere, Jesus, who has authority over demons, tells them to be quiet. They got to be quiet, kicks them out of somebody, and they got to go. And now they got to wait till sundown. So you could imagine, and it's spread all around. Remember last week, they said news of him spread quickly throughout all the region. So imagine how much, without social media and without text messaging and phone calls, imagine how much they were talking about what happened, that now everybody's showing up to the house, and they waited till evening, right? So Exodus 20:10, just so you know. But on the seventh day, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You must not do any work. So that's what they were making sure that they didn't do. They didn't do anything on the Sabbath. Boom. But when it ended, man, they showed up. So we also see that it says the whole town was assembled at the door. Now we can assume that this is hyperbole as well. So we see it happening in real time, multiple times. Hyperbole. In the same way that like we'll go somewhere and somebody will ask us, oh, how was it? And we're like, everybody was there. Everybody was there. Literally everybody wasn't there because I'm talking to somebody who was asking me, how was it? So apparently they weren't there, but we talk like this. Yeah, it was crazy. Everybody was there. So we understand hyperbole. So you don't have to assume like the whole literal town showed up at Peter's house, but just a whole lot of people, right? So yeah, the news spread so fast, but the news of it caused people to spring into action. And think about this, right? They saw Jesus cast out a demon, but then they brought him the sick as well. So the people in the synagogue, they just saw somebody have a demon cast out of him. They didn't see him heal the sick in the synagogue, but yet they're bringing the sick to him. So good point to notice. So imagine all of this happening if Jesus did not heal Peter's mother-in-law. Imagine the whole town showing up on Peter's doorstep and his mother-in-law is still sick. Not only would Peter not be able to be as attentive to what was going on, but this may have deterred people from coming. You know, if they arrived and then they saw that Peter's mother-in-law was sick, they might have spread the news and tell everyone, hey, don't come. Peter's mother-in-law is sick. I know you want to see the guy who cast out the demon earlier, but Peter's mother-in-law is sick. We got to respect that. So it's crazy how fast news travels without social media. If as fast as they spread the news that was going on, they could have spread the news just as fast to say, hey, you can't go to Peter's house. So it's interesting to me how every action leads to another action. The exorcism at the synagogue led to the news. Let me back up even more. The action of calling Peter and Andrew off of the boat led to them going to the synagogue, which led to the exorcism in the synagogue. They all witnessed that, which led to the news spreading, which led to people arriving to Jesus's house, which was only possible because Jesus healed Peter's mother-in-law and made space for their arrival. It's all in God's sovereign plan. And people were healed, demons were cast out, and Jesus's ministry was being authenticated in this moment, all from these dots that connected. Now, I don't know if you guys have seen this happen in your own life, but there are times when I think about all the dots that had to connect for me to get saved. And I'm just blown away by how his hand guided my life and brought me to salvation. And all of these things that, you look back and you're like, why was that happening? Or you're going through something, you're like, why is this happening to me? And now you fast forward looking back at it and you're like, wow, man, God had his hand on that situation that I was so anxious about at the time. And going through that situation, he used that to get me to him. I don't know if you guys have ever experienced that. I'm assuming that if you are saved, you can look back at moments and see how all of the dots connected to that God used to bring you to him. We see that happen in real time just in these past few passages. We're not even out of the first chapter of Mark, guys. The way God is incredible. All right. This stuff can like bring you to tears if you think about it. Now, before we move on, any questions, comments, or concerns up to this point right here? We're good to go. Thumbs up. We're moving. I see you thinking over there, Angel. All right, cool. We're going to keep moving. So now it comes to the closing, to the end of the verse that I left off before we got into that last topic. Says, and he would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him. It always interests me as to why Jesus didn't want the demons to speak, especially when they were declaring his true identity for all to hear. Now, if we skip over to Luke chapter 4, verse 40, we see that it says, he would not allow them to speak because they knew he was the Messiah. So, man, that is a loaded statement right there. What does that even mean? Wouldn't he want people to know he's the Messiah? Doesn't this attest to who he is, because this is the spiritual realm saying that he is the Messiah? So these are things that you have to ponder on a little bit. So there's a few reasons why I think Jesus did not permit them to speak at that time, right? So the first is to avoid misunderstanding his mission. At the time, many Jews at that time had these expectations of what the Messiah was going to look like, such as being a political or military leader who would free the Jews from Roman rule. And if the demons proclaimed that Jesus as the Messiah, people might misunderstand Jesus's mission, which was more spiritual than it was political in any sense, right? So the Gospels show that people often misunderstood Jesus's mission. The disciples themselves were with him throughout his whole ministry, and he kept having to say, like, you guys don't get it? How do you not get it yet, right? So we also see how people misinterpreted him on their own without the demon saying anything. When Jesus fed the 5,000, and we'll get to that eventually, they wanted to make him king by force. They were trying to make him king right then and there after he fed the 5,000. And so what did Jesus do after that? He bounced on them. He left. He withdrew. So he often needed to clarify that his kingdom was not of this world. So the second reason why I think he didn't allow the demons to speak was to prevent a premature confrontation, right? So if Jesus's true identity and mission were fully revealed too soon, it could have led to an increase of opposition from religious leaders and Roman authorities before the appointed time. This could have hindered his entire ministry and the fulfillment of his purpose. We also got to remember, he's only got 4 of his apostles right now. So this is super early into his ministry. He's just got 4 of them. So he's preventing a premature confrontation with the powers that be, so to speak, right? So number 3, it controlled the spread of his fame, sort of, right? So Jesus often sought to keep his miracles somewhat quiet to control the spread of his fame. If his fame spread too quickly, it could have made it difficult for him to move freely and teach, as crowds would gather more to see more miracles and more healings and listen to more of his teachings. And we'll see this unfold in our next study. So number 4, I mean, you guys see how fast things move even when he's trying to keep it quiet. Imagine if he wasn't trying to keep it quiet. So, all right, number 4, he did this just straight up to show his authority over demons. That is definitely one of the reasons, I believe. So by silencing the demons, Jesus demonstrated his authority over them, and this showed that even though they recognized him, they were subject to his command and had no power over him. We discussed this last week. And then number 5, I believe that it's to prevent false testimony. Jesus didn't want the testimony about who he is coming from evil sources. Even though the demons knew who he was, their acknowledgement was not the kind of testimony Jesus wanted it. He prefers the recognition and testimony to come from his teachings, his miracles, his fulfillment of scripture, and ultimately his followers. Me and you guys, right? We have the privilege of spreading the true testimony of Jesus Christ. And as his followers, that's what we're called to do. We're called to share his teachings, his miracles, his grace, his love, his fulfillment of scripture. We're called to do all that stuff. That ain't for the demons to do. That's for us. That's our privilege, guys. It's a privilege to be able to share the good news with people. And we get that privilege. He's not allowing the demons to do that. That's for his followers. That's a privilege that only we get to have, right? So praise God, he doesn't silence us when we proclaim who he is to the world. And even though the world tries to silence us. Isn't it incredible how it's flipped, right? So in the Bible, the demons are declaring who Jesus is. And now the demonic world order that is out there are trying to silence us from telling people who Jesus is. Interesting, right? But you guys do know that no matter what the world tries to do, they will never be able to silence or stop his message from spreading to the entire world. We are fighting from victory, not for it. Amen. All right, guys. And that concludes our Bible study for today. Do you guys have any questions? I know it's kind of like an abrupt ending. The Gospel of Mark has an abrupt ending as well. Any questions, comments, concerns, anything? And I lost my, oh, there it is. Well, all right. Sounds good. You guys, I don't know if you're shy or if I do a really good job. I'm just going to say like, yeah, I'm doing a really good job. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to convince myself of that. Right. All right, guys. Well, I'm just going to stop the recording. Then we'll say a quick prayer and we will get out of here. Gio, if you could pass the host back over to me, that would be great.